Very soon after one of the most stringent lockdowns in the world was announced suddenly by Prime Minister Modi in March 2020, a slew of labor law relaxations outside of the proposed codes were announced by several states, even as a very large migrant worker crisis unfolded in the form of millions of migrant workers fleeing their workplaces to trudge home to their villages, often hundreds of kilometers away. Now, this process had been set in motion in 2019 with various labor laws being brought under four labor codes, which unfolded gradually. And there were delays in implementation, primarily owing to strong opposition from trade unions. But the pandemic, in fact, became the opportunity to push forward several changes, primarily initiated by states. Now, despite the similar kinds of pressures for labor deregulations worldwide as part of neoliberal policies all over the world, several countries, in fact, in the pandemic introduced measures to protect employment and wages. Now, just a few examples. Pakistan introduced a relief package to bring poorest workers back to work with something called the 10 Billion Trees Project. Malaysia had an employment insurance scheme which provided a wage subsidy program. Italy extended up to 80% of the gross salary of workers, and so on. So there is quite a reasonably long list of countries which actually provided for active employment and worker support at the time of the pandemic. So India's response, therefore, has been one of the most drastic. For example, in more recent years, the notion of outsourcing and contracting between firms has taken on newer dimensions. So in addition to the usual outsourcing arrangements that have been written about over the past 20 or 30 years, some specific changes occurred more intensively in the last few years. Asset-light business models where corporations own as few assets as possible are seen to have come up as a contrast to asset-heavy, vertically integrated models, which, despite offering greater control, are bulky because they tie up significant capital and frequently prove less flexible in a fast-changing environment. Companies, therefore, in a bid to become asset-light, need to keep the option open to sell assets, enter into contracts that help production but do not add assets, and tailor employment to suit these options. For example, it's become common in the hotel industry for large hotels to sell their assets and then lease them back for a variable or fixed rent to retain control. In the airline segment, Cathay Pacific and DHL share aircraft to provide combined passenger and cargo flights and streaming. And there are any number of examples in India as well where this model has been adopted. So given this fast changing world of inter-corporation relationships, the workplace has undergone drastic changes. In Airtel or any of the other mobile telephone corporations, with all operations outsourced to large established firms, in fact, Airtel became the first global example to have 100% outsourcing. It's an established practice to share employees through a loose arrangement known as rebadging, wherein those employed in one firm get deployed into one where work is outsourced, allowing both firms to avoid longer-term commitments or payouts. For such arrangements, inter-firm transfers of employees become necessary without hurdles of labor regulations being encountered that prevent totally flexible deployment. Different attributes of the standard employment relationship, such as the bilateral employer-employee relationship, standardized and legislated working hours, and provision of social security are turned on their head. The reorganization of work with digital labor platforms involves an unbundling of tasks and a deepening of the division of labor, which also has a spatial dimension, since it broadens the geographic boundaries of labor markets and allows operations at a global scale. So there are two contentious aspects of gig work that have been pointed out, which is the classification of workers and the applicability of sector-specific regulations to platform companies. Companies often argue that they are mere platforms or aggregators and not employers, and those that work for them are independent contractors and not workers. Despite the government asking for estimates of the workforce in the gig economy and the Social Security Code recognizing the gig worker as a category for provision of social security, there's been no definitive official estimate of the size of the platform economy workforce. In a study that was done in 2019, there was an estimate that 11 platforms employed about 3 million workers. But that's one of the few estimates that is available. It was only in 2019 that gig or platform work even found explicit mention in a labor code, as I mentioned earlier. But those doing gig work are not acknowledged as workers in the formal sense. So the obfuscation of worker or employee status of the vast number of people employed prevents the actual availability of estimates even to be able to extend social security to them, leave alone make employers responsible for protecting their rights. And the disintegration of tasks and commensurate remuneration structures by the hour, by the gig, as advance credit to be adjusted against work done, and so on. And there are any number of different kinds of arrangements that companies are entering into with their so-called partners. This, combined with the absence of a defined workplace, produces little accountability through the entire system, including employers, intermediaries, and the state. So what I'm pointing out, and I'll stop here, what I'm pointing out here is that the changes in labor regulations and its imperatives need to be understood also in relation to how industrial structure is changing. And this, the government's commitment, therefore, to capital is absolutely unequivocal. And that's something that has been revealed very clearly in the pandemic.